Hey gang, it's KR King of D&D Homebrew. Today I'm going to talk about a flooded dungeon, and this comes from a discussion on my Discord channel. I started it a week and a half ago. It's been so great. I'm getting people coming on. I love to check this. I love interacting with my viewers. And one of them, Mark Marius, we were talking about maps actually. And he, on one of these maps that he had created for his campaign, he had these flooded ruins of Marius, this place, with little buildings, and it showed the water. And I said, oh, what's that all about? I would be interested in that as a player if I saw a general map. And he said it was these flooded city, and it was basically a flooded mega dungeon. And I thought to myself, the flooded dungeon is a concept. Underwater stuff is something that we don't run that much in D&D. It's kind of difficult. It's kind of problematic. We don't, at least for me. And so what I wanted to think about was, what are the ways in which you can run, say, a flooded dungeon? What are the implications of this? How do you facilitate the players, but how do you also make it so that some of the limitations that there are there in terms of being underwater, it's not most player characters' natural environment. How do you do it in such a way that it's interesting? It's not going to be all the time. It's going to be a specific thing. How do you set it up such that it'll work for your campaign? Now, right off the bat, what I'm going to say is there are character classes, especially in, like say D&D, when you get the multiverse, they have some, aquatic elves or something like that. Things that can breathe underwater. There are in Pathfinder as well and other systems. I'm not referring to those. You may have someone like that in your campaign, and that's going to, perhaps lend itself. But the other characters, most people are not going to be a race that can breathe underwater. So that's what this is dedicated towards. How do you handle it when you don't have PCs that are, function well underwater? And the other element here is you have flooded caverns. In fact, I did a video, I'll put a link here to it, about creating a sea cave map. One of my least viewed videos, wasn't popular. But I really like the idea of a sea cave. That's one where, at low tide, the entrance is visible, and then high tide comes up, water floods in there. So you've got a certain amount of time to go in and out of this place. It has this kind of ticking clock to its construction. I'm not talking about that per se. There are caverns that obviously that are flooded. In fact, this is the most common form of this. But I'm not necessarily going to talk about those. There's also underwater caverns. Things live in flooded caverns underwater because it provides safety, right? Or the moray eel that hunts from a hole. That's why you don't put your hand in some hole in the, the coral reef. They hide there because things can't come at them from above, right? You're safe there relatively. You control the entrance. And also undersea creatures, let's say Saugin or something like that, or Kuatoa, who have these underground complexes. We think of those as sort of built out of the coral reef or whatever, not necessarily using, masonry to put that together. That's all interesting, and it's all really cool. But what I'm going to talk about is something that's been flooded. It was constructed to be in a dry area with oxygen. It wasn't above ground, below ground. And then for whatever reason, the water table has risen, and it's now flooded. So that is our first question when you're creating a flooded dungeon. What happened? Was it simply that as time shifted, the water table rose? Maybe there was some natural catastrophe, some natural dam that occurred that broke and the water table rose and suddenly this was, flooded. Maybe there was some magical type catastrophe or something, but maybe an earthquake that again shifted the water table, something like that caused all or part of the dungeon to be flooded. And then when you build the dungeon, how much of it? So do you have a level or two that isn't flooded? Do you have so let's say you have two levels of a dungeon that are just standard, and then you go below that, it's flooded, except for one area that somehow is sealed, right? And this area goes down 2 or 3 more levels, but the flooding, there's doorways or something that are protecting it unless they're opened by, say, the player characters. And then finally, are there air pockets within the dungeon? And here's the thing, it doesn't have to make sense, right? It's a fantasy game, it's D&D. When we've done these, years ago I used to do these, I had air pocketed areas, I had all sorts of stuff. I remember one time some mega dungeon, I had an underground city that was all within the flooded area. I mean, you can do that, right? You can do anything you want. But once you do that, just remember that any areas that are flooded, you have the limitations of breathing and movement, visibility, all that stuff, the advantages that undersea creatures have. So you're always going to have the various barriers within a dungeon that is flooded. That would be the same if you have an aquatic adventure in an ocean environment or whatever. The thing is, you're in this contained environment as opposed to being out in the water. You don't have that 3D effect of things coming at you or below you if you're swimming around. So the thing is if you have a submerged dungeon, what is the entrance to it, right? Is it a well that goes down and then there's water and you just go down in this well and then you have to swim through and suddenly you're in this dungeon complex? Is it, as I said, there's maybe a level or two that are not flooded and then you see stairs going down into the flooded level? How, the access, because the nice thing about this is you have amphibious creatures, say Kuatoa, something like that. Saugin can go above ground that can come up and feed on things or whatever, right? Land-based creatures, of course, they're then out of their element when they do that. Or is it been sealed off? There's some catastrophe such that it's this underground complex and the players have to somehow break in, right? And as I said, you can mix and match those. You can have one level that's here in a pool, classic example. Whenever my players saw a pool, they always wanted to investigate. They always wanted to take, the water breathe, freedom of movement, or anything they could to check things out. They might first just swim down as much as they can. There's rules on how long you can hold your breath, depending on the system. But if it quickly became obvious that there were chambers and whatnot, they had to make that decision. Are we going to explore this? And here's the thing. Once you've decided I want to have one level, and then I'll have a pool, and then the pool will lead to these flooded caverns, and then down below that I'm going to have some areas of air or whatnot, why would the players go there, right? This becomes the big deal. The reason that people don't do a lot of aquatic adventures is it's difficult to do when you have air-based, the standard player races, and there's a lot of risks involved. So why am I going to do that? They're going to avoid these unless there's a compelling reason. So when you do have your dungeon, first of all, the players see a pool, maybe they dive in there and they see that there's a chamber, they come back up. Why would they continue to explore, right? Why would they take the spells, depending on your system, to be able to breathe water, to be able to move freely, which is hard. That doesn't affect very many creatures. Why are they going to do that, right? They're probably not going to do that just if you have a pool there, especially if there's other things to explore. And if it just ends that way, maybe they're all going to say, hey, we need to explore this. But guess what? Just like in real life, people are afraid to go into caves. When you have it diving in a cave, I used to scuba dive many years ago, and I went into wrecks and stuff. I lived in the Great Lakes, and that was scary enough. The idea of going into a cave, to be a cave diver, you have to be experienced. I did not have that experience. That's dangerous, right? Well, players have the same reaction. They know. If you run out of, if your water breathing spell or whatever it is, your thing that you're using goes out, you will have very limited time or you are going to drown, right? So they're not going to want to just explore. So you have to give them a reason to do this. So they hear about something, they've learned that there's this underwater chamber, and there's some great magic item there? Okay, but where is it, right? Do they have a map? Do they know how much of the cave or the tunnels, the dungeon is flooded? Are there air pockets? Are there areas where, if for some reason, they run out of time with a spell or some device, they can breathe air and rest or whatever to get new spells? You're going to need to give them that information. So oftentimes you need at least, maybe not a complete map, but an idea of, first of all, what is this thing they're looking for? Have they been geist, quest, or is it some great treasure, or is there a ticking clock that's forcing them to go into the flooded caverns? And then I always say give them a general idea of the layout, what they can expect, how much of this is flooded. If you say, no, it's a mystery, go ahead and explore, that can be a scary thing, because let's look at what it takes. So the water breathe in 5e, for example, 8 hours, I think 10 creatures. I'll put the stats up here. And then in Pathfinder, I think it's an hour at second level. The water breathe in 5e is third. This is second, but you can heighten it to third and have 8 hours. I think in the old days, 10 minutes per level, so you had to be fifth to throw it, so that's an hour. Not very long. The 5e one is powerful, but here's the thing. Freedom of movement. 4th level spell 5e, 1 creature, not very long. Pathfinder in a similar way. The freedom of movement's going to get you. You're not just going to be able to walk around. So when you look in there, again, if you're not an aquatic race, now that, again, rings and things, freedom of movement, devices, this is the thing. If you're going to have something special, when you start to look into this and what it's like to operate underwater, if you swimming speed versus if your movement is very halved, you can only attack with things like the trident, the javelin. In terms of spells, no fireballs, very limited movement. And so you're going to have to, if you really want to have this work, maybe you have, a wand of freedom of movement, right? And here's the only chance the players are ever going to have to use it. I'm just throwing this off here off the top of my head, but I know the limit. I know what it's like as a player and a GM. GM, you set this stuff up, and the players are like, "It's just too deadly. I don't want to run out of something. I can't move around or whatever." The water breathe does last a while, but again, it can wear off, especially if they get down there deep and they want to take a long rest. They have to come all the way back out or whatever. So you want to think about they're not going to do this very often unless they have something that they really want to get. And then when they do it, they're going to want to know that they have some ability to breathe underwater, to have some freedom of movement or not. And then the other thing is the creatures that are down there. Because if you look at some of the underwater creatures, Kraken is very nasty. The Morkoth, one of the great monsters of all time. How often do you get a chance to run one, right? High level. The dragon turtle is a little insane. But you look at some of these underwater creatures that you never get to, run. They're going to be down there, right? They're going to be in their environment. And when you start thinking about what it takes to move around down there, here's another thing: visibility, right? Because if, let's say, the water's clear, you just have your dark vision or whatever, a light spell will show underwater. But what if the water's totally filled with material, right? You can't see. It's just like being in a cloud or something. And what if you go into an ultra clear area and then either the players get into some kind of scuffle or whatever and the sand comes up, right? Because if you've ever played with a darkness spell is a very nasty spell, right? And you might have this whole area suddenly, it's not just like a radius spell where you can get outside of it. The entire chamber could be filled with this. Again, do you want to have the whole underwater thing totally with material and you can't see? Or do you just want to have a short area where they have to go through, right, the players? So again, you've got monsters that are in their environment. Cool monsters, but again, the players potentially are not. They're at a disadvantage right there. Then you've got visibility issues if there's stuff in the water or if you say dust gets turned up. Now, in a dungeon environment, you could say that it's all constructed, it's all clean, and you have good visibility, right? Because the players are already potentially under disadvantage for moving around down there. But again, what I would suggest, if you want to do this in an interesting way, let's just say that you're going to create an underwater dungeon, flooded dungeon, whatever. You want to run things like a Morkoth, like an Aboleth with the Chul creatures and, all this kind of stuff. And you want to just run it out, then give the players something. As I said, the wand of freedom of movement, a helm that projects freedom of movement in all directions, Because how often, if they start, using this to go all over the oceans, maybe that's interesting to you, maybe not. Maybe you make it a limited amount of time. A scroll, a spell, a wand of water breathing, however you want to do it. So that those inherent, because again, using third level spells, in 5e, the freedom of movement is a fourth level spell and it takes one creature. So really, you're gonna do that? So you're automatically going, unless of course they all want to roll a party of aquatic elves, but then you're just running underwater half the time. This is a thing where you're going into an environment the players don't usually go to, a flooded cavern, right? And so what you want to think about if this is a special kind of thing is, and they don't just have to be lying around. Look, in front of the flood is a wand. What do you know? It's freedom of movement. No, maybe they have to go get something. They have to go to someone, depending on the level of magic in your world. Are those available? Can I buy wands at the local magic shop? Or do I have to go somewhere, make a deal, get one, do this favor, that, because I'm getting the Helm of Infinite Power or the Helm of Infinite Evil that other evil creatures are searching for? So you're saying, I know the players aren't going to do this, so I'm going to give them some options, some capabilities to be able to do this without using tons of spells for their water breathe or freedom of movement. I'm going to give them some information about this dungeon. And maybe if you give them all this water breathe and freedom of movement, and then you can treat it, I suppose, like an ordinary dungeon, just you have to explore it. But oftentimes, they're going to want to know what those areas are, especially you could make it such that they have to use those spells. So you got 7th, 8th level party, some 3rd level spells, some 4th level, whatever, and they know that there's areas of air in here. So they have to cross through some sections that are flooded. So in other words, you have a dungeon where the openings, I'm doing this on screen, The opening is here. They have to go down here to the flooded area, come back up. Here's an underground section that is not flooded. Then maybe there's more going in all directions. This is interesting. I'm doing it this way. But, so that's something where they can take a rest or whatever. They could use their water breathe. Maybe they don't have the freedom of movement to go through those sections. Maybe there's site limitations. The thing is, probably they're not going to go there unless they know there's something there valuable. The greatest treasure ever known is in the flooded caverns of Kublai Khan. Others have tried, but they've been thwarted by the legendary traps. And, the creature's a megalodon type creature, something like that, where they know it's underwater. It's a different kind of environment. They're preparing themselves for this. They're going to use these spells, and they know enough. We can get back up here, maybe take a long rest. What lives in there? Then they go back into the underwater sections, and then perhaps they have just enough freedom of movement type stuff to have a final battle at the the treasure of Kublai Khan, whatever its guardian is, to be interesting. And all of these things, you creating an environment that's unique. We've all read about the underwater creatures, and we've all thought about underwater adventures, but how often do we run them? And the reason we don't are all those reasons. Most player character races just aren't suitable to go underwater. So you just create an environment. You think about what the levels are. You think about what the players have to get. You give them this kind of ability. You think about the cool creatures. As I said, the Morkoth to me was always a really cool one. You let them decide sandbox campaign, because if you have a ticking clock, the entire material world will be destroyed unless you go to the flooded caverns of Kublai Khan. Well, okay, here we go, right? But if they have a choice and they see that there's opportunities, I think they're going to go for it because it's a cool thing. Because the minute I looked at that map from Merc I said, I want to flooded ruins. What's that? How can do I hear about anything? Do I know anything? Can I find a map? Can I find, at one time it was above ground. What can I learn about it? Because it's a cool environment, but I need to be able to operate there. I can't just, hold my breath. I need magic, and you have it in a fantasy setting. So think about using a flooded dungeon. I think it's a really cool idea. And check out my Discord. We're having a lot of great discussions and talking about ideas to creating a homebrewed world. I'd love to hear your comments about this if you've used flooded caverns. Most importantly, keep playing an RPG game, whichever one you decide. Tell somebody else about it.